Kosovo, and other distinguished guests.
Let's go. The President.
Thank you.
Anish, you over there. So let me welcome you for the last session. So we are sort of between them and the dinner, but I think we have an important topic to cover. So thank you again for being here. I will just briefly introduce you, of course, starting with a distinguished guest, President of Kosovo, and then I have a few questions. Let's have a discussion, and then we have time. We go to the young people in the corner and ask some questions from the floor. So it's about rethinking resilience, responding to geopolitical shifts with industrial policy. So it's got the political side and it's got the industry side, which I guess we have represented this panel. I'm very happy and honored to have the President of Kosovo here today, President Osmani. Welcome. She has been President of Kosovo since 2002. Is by training
21. 21.
21, yeah.
Yeah, not that long.
I should have known, looking at you, that this is...
We're a democracy, what can I say?
Right. So 221, fair. And I think by training you're a lawyer, and I heard you even studied at Princeton for a while in the United States.
Pittsburgh University, University of Pittsburgh School of Law, Pennsylvania. Yes.
Okay, very good. And she's, of course, heading a very important country. I think you have a meeting tomorrow also with the German president here in Germany. And her issues, of course, are very much anti-corruption is a big theme for you, I understand. And the other one, of course, the big one, the elephant in the room, don't I want to say something about that, is normalizing the relationships with Kosovo, which also has a big impact, not a big impact, but also occupied Germany for a while, and we were involved in that. So let me ask you to thank the President of Kosovo. Thank you for being at the Berlin Global Dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I go to Merit Janow, incredibly distinguished person. She has been dean at Columbia for 20 years. A trade expert, industrial policy expert. We met in New York. You are really somebody who's thought these things through. I'd like you to take a little bit the American perspective in all of this, if possible. She's also the chair of Mastercard, and I think interestingly, which we also discussed when I was in New York, she was on the appellate body of the WTO board, right, for many years, I guess.
4 years.
4 years, which is, of course, the big thing in trade and WTO. Which is, I think, a pity what's going on with the WTO, but I may ask you a question on that one. Merit, thank you for being here. Merit.
Thank you.
Then we have a return guest from last year, Anish. Shah, who's, of course, heading up Mahindra Group, this global CEO, the group CEO, 260,000 employees, conglomerate, 20 industries, 100 countries. Last time I saw you in India, you were very, can I say, proud about the exponential growth your companies has experienced. So this is not atypical. Well, this is an Indian success story. It'd be interesting to hear your view about what you think about industrial policy in Europe. And I saw that you like you like cricket and American football. Looking at you, I wonder which position you were playing. But
let me clarify.
Sorry
I never
about that.
played American football.
In front of TV.
You just watches it.
My favorite team is the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Okay,
so is mine.
That's right. So welcome, Anish. Let him welcome us. Thank you, Anish. And finally, of course, big issue, industrial policy, geopolitics. We need China to be in the room, and we need somebody who talks about China. And we're very happy to have Patrick Zhong here, who is the chairman of M31 Capital, which is a big investment firm, private equity, and he has been in the business for 20 years. Various positions, thinking about investing. I think you've also invested in Tencent and Alibaba at some point in a different position, and you have various board positions. So Patrick has maybe can take a little bit the Chinese perspective. You're here also with a big delegation of Chinese entrepreneurs. You were here before at ESMT, so very happy to have you here. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so session is about industrial policy and maybe also national security issues and how it relates to industrial policy. This is a big issue in Europe. We just had the Draghi report, which we're discussing in many sessions already. So the question is sort of, how do you see this? Where's the world going with this? And as we have a slogan here or a motto of the conference, is there common ground? I mean, Inflation Reduction Act, can we sort of look at the win-win situations? I know Merit has important positions on that one. But me first spend the first few minutes with the president, maybe more on the political side, President Osmani. I think you've just returned from UNGA, from the United Nations session, and of course there are lots of conflicts in the world. As I was saying this morning, even recently, some bad news has been arriving in the Middle East, but there's the other big conflict is with Ukraine, and Kosovo, of course, is very much in the middle of all of that. So the world is in a very difficult situation, sort of being a leader of an important country geopolitically in Europe. How do you see the world going?
Well, again, thank you so much for including me, and I really look forward to listening from each of the panelists and learning from your experience as politicians. It's one of my favorite times when we are in the same panel with CEOs and global companies so that we can really get that perspective and learn a lot as politicians. Kosovo is a small country, but with an important story to tell. It's a story of resilient people that have built a country on the very foundations of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the fundamentals of freedom. And of course, having been colonized and under occupation for more than a century, we never take our freedoms for granted because too much sacrifice have been made for the democracy, the freedom, the independence that we enjoy today. But at the same time, the story of Kosovo tells us all what democracies can achieve when we get together. Based on those very same principles and values. And it's a success story that makes proud not only its people, but also our partners globally, because it's one of the most important investments in peace. For the very first time in the history of the Western Balkans, we are living in peace. That region was shaped by conflicts for centuries and centuries. For the very first time, we have a little bit more than 2 decades that our children are living in peace. So every generation had to go through a war, and our children are the very first generation in the history of our nation that are growing up in peace. And that's an enormous achievement.
Isn't the peace being threatened?
I do believe so, and I was getting at that. When the war in Kosovo ended, we thought that when we all said never again, that we would learn those lessons from history. But unfortunately, even now, in 2024, there's war in the middle of Europe, a war that is threatening all of us, not just the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the freedom of Ukraine. And I believe that the war in Ukraine, the unjust and unprovoked war that Russia waged against Ukraine, is a litmus test for democracies way beyond Europe. And we need to make sure that the principles that are set and the help that we all provide to Ukraine for winning are enough for Ukraine to really win this war for all of us. Because if it doesn't happen that way, it's unfortunately an encouragement, and it will embolden autocrats, not just the autocrat in Russia, but autocrats all around the globe, to act against smaller states who might have a less amount of weapons with absolute disregard of the principles of international law and the rules-based order. And very, very dangerous times will come for all of us if these principles are not upheld in the case of Ukraine. We already see that Putin is very much interested to have a spillover effect of Ukraine. There are constant efforts to destabilize the Western Balkans. And it is so crucial that the Western world does not lose its attention on the Western Balkans, because things can really get out of hand quickly. And of course, when there's lack of safety and stability, There's also lack of investment. There's lack of economic development and prosperity. So practically lack of national security, and when that security is threatened, has a spillover effect on every area of life, from economic development to trade relations with other countries, and to just the betterment of life of all of our citizens, not just in Kosovo, but also the rest of the region. So we think it's so fundamental that these basic principles of international law, but also the very values that stand at the foundations of our value-based system, which are the European Union, NATO, and other organizations that we seek to become a member of, should be protected at all costs. Because by protecting these values, we also ensure economic development, prosperity, and also trade relations with the wider world, not just with our continent and the continent that we're part of.
So this is, of course, a position which, not of course, but this is a position a lot of people in Western Europe, I think, share. But how do you see sort of the conflict ending? Are we going to defeat Russia, or are we going to deter Russia? How do you, at some point, do we need to go for dialogue and discussions? I guess your point right now was we have to be strong, we have to be resistant, but where is this going to end up? What do you hope this will be end up as?
Well, of course, there should be dialogue at some point in time, but my point is there must be a principled dialogue. And not a dialogue where the aggressor is rewarded with territory, because that sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. If Putin is awarded with Ukrainian territory as a result of some sort of a peace process, we can't call that a just peace. That is, in fact, an encouragement for him to continue invading other countries in the neighborhood, and at the same time destabilize regions such as the Western Balkans. And that, in turn, achieves not just his imperialistic ambitions about more territory, but also achieves his ambitions about destroying the values-based systems that the EU and NATO as a transatlantic partnership are. Because if the Western Balkans is destabilized, if the eastern flank is destabilized, the entire European continent is destabilized. So we cannot talk about a project of Europe whole, free, and at peace, which is the dream of all of us, if very essential parts of Europe are under constant instability and attacks by Russia and its proxies. So I think it's essential that when the moment comes for that dialogue, that it's a principled dialogue based on the already existing rules-based international order, and not to reward an aggressor with territory, because that is not the ending. That would simply be the beginning of new conflicts in the wider region, and would, I think, destroy Europe as we know it.
It was an interesting discussion also earlier on. I'm not going to ask you yet to speak on the role of China in all of that, by the way, because this is a very fundamental issue for Europe and also India, by the way. But we'll have one more question for the president. What did I want? Are you worried about, you don't have to answer that, given you're president of a country, are you worried about the US elections?
Kosovo has been blessed with bipartisan support from the United States, so we're practically perhaps one of the few cases in the world that has always had the US support. So we became free, we were liberated during a Democrat government, we became independent during a Republican government, and we've built our democratic and economic resilience with both Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, they have different approaches, but we've learned how to work with both, and ultimately it's the will of the American people that decides that. We're going to work with whoever is elected. But as I said, of course, it takes quite a different approach depending on who is elected. But Kosovo really counts on that support because the US has played a leadership role in rallying the democratic world behind the people of Kosovo during some of the darkest hours in our history, we will forever be grateful, but of course now we're not the top priority in anybody's desk. It's a lot of conflicts happening around the world, and I'm glad that we're not that kind of priority. Right now, when we talk about Kosovo, we talk about how we can bring in more investments with, being the youngest population in Europe, tech-savvy, multilingual, with so much potential, with free trade agreements, with all around Europe. Investing in Kosovo, it's not just investing in tiny little Kosovo, but in fact in hundreds of millions of Europeans. So with a lot of that potential, the best tax system, and with a 100% compliance with EU standards, looks like the best destination for everyone here to invest. So if you would be interested, please come to Kosovo. So we don't have to be, we have no time to be worried, because to be very frank, we're working with a lot of resilience and persistence to make sure that we create partnerships with countries around the world. So we will be working with whoever the people of the United States elect.
Excellent. Last question, and then we'll turn to the panel. On the Draghi report, so you just talked about Europe, but talk about the economy, and we'll be talking about that also a little bit more in a second. I asked the same question to the Deputy Prime Minister of Albania an hour ago. The Draghi report was not very positive, or was actually saying that there are quite a few issues in Europe which we need to solve. But you're still obviously interested and want to be part of the European Union. How do you look at this Draghi report? Does that apply also to Kosovo, or does it make you get scared of Europe, actually?
Not at all. I mean, Kosovo has had to meet so many challenges in its path towards the European Union that I don't think anything can scare us any longer. 97% of the people of Kosovo are pro-European Union. Even if we go back hundreds of years before the European Union existed, it was our nation that led Europe into defending what at that time, 600 years ago, was called the European civilization. So these foundations that are, as the cornerstone of the EU, are still very much what lead our people in our vision towards the European Union. Perhaps because of the very painful past that we have had, we're very resilient. And I think what the Draghi report points out is simply an honest picture of the challenges. And I think the Europe, or the European Union that we want, is one that takes up these challenges rather than complaining about them. Oftentimes when we participate in a lot of summits and roundtables or discussions like these, people tend to reject honesty, even if it's, criticism about real challenges that exist in organizations such as the European Union. I think we need to take them as opportunities, because only in that way we can push forward for a European Union that includes the rest of countries that truly believe in these shared values. So I do hope that enlargement is one of the key issues that is taken forward, because we believe that an enlarged Europe is a safe Europe. Europe as a continent will not be, as I said, whole, free, and at peace and safe unless the Western Balkans become part of it. So I think we should, not allow our patience to get lost. And despite of the very complex and sometimes very boring and a lot of unfairness that exists in the process and the challenges, as the Draghi report points out, we should never look elsewhere. Our path towards the European Union is our only path, not just as a sort of a vision, but also the real hard work that it requires. And we're very, very determined to stick to it.
Yeah, I think, the fact the Balkans having a perspective of being part of Europe geopolitically is a key issue. And we have Emmanuel Macron here tomorrow. He will talk about Europe. Yes. Let's see what he will say. But I think that's very good. Let me move on to Merit, Janow, and maybe ask you a little bit about industrial policy and security policy. And maybe start with a question on the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is a big thing of the United States, which has triggered, I think, Brian Deese, who's also here, was, I think, the author or the architect of that. I don't know if he's in the room yet. Is that a good example of industrial policy? And how does it relate to national security? How do you see all of that evolving from an American point of view? merit.
Well, thank you very much, Henrik, and thank you for including me. This is an extraordinary forum you've pulled together. It's a real privilege to hear the views I'm hearing. Well, maybe one comment about what is industrial policy, and then I'll turn more directly. You know, industrial policy obviously has a history in the United States when you think of policy interventions in pursuit of affecting economic activity for a public purpose. And so there is a long history. And it's sometimes been focused on fostering innovation, supporting basic R&D, creating, you know, NIH, creating defense capabilities. There is a history, but it sort of came back to life in a new way when we faced competition from Japan. That was one moment. And at that point, you know, I happened to be a trade negotiator in the US government responsible for Japan and China. And what the US decided...
You were the deputy at the USTR.
USTR. Right? And what we thought was necessary was to, you know, pursue market access, use trade policy as an instrument to attack what we thought was Japanese industrial policy, which was a combination of a closed market, supports to priority domestic industries, and the use of government procurement for indigenous champions. And we thought obtaining market access, getting foreign firms access to government procurement and opening up was the way forward. In addressing industrial policies there and globally. Well, the world has changed a lot since those days, and I see what's being done now is a use of old and new instruments. You know, I would say the Inflation Reduction Act needs to be thought of in tandem with the CHIPS Act and the you know, and the Investment Act on infrastructure. And together, you know, they do represent the largest investment in the energy transition that the US has ever taken. And really, they're being used to support multiple objectives. National security is part of it, but so is support for domestic manufacturing, manufacturing employment, for the energy transition, for innovation and R&D. So part of the complexity, I think, of what's being done is that a set of measures are pursuing multiple objectives. So far, the evidence...
So is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it makes it very complicated. I'm not going to say good or bad. I think they're, you know, focusing on the energy transition, trying to support that more robustly is, I consider it a good thing, a priority. How we do it and the effects, the externalities, the effects on our trading partners, the effects on the world is something that is raising some complexity. Maybe we can talk about that.
Having been at the WTO, you should know.
Well, yeah, but I think, you know, the focus of this was not to harm others. It was to create an indigenous capacity. And, you know, we couldn't couldn't get consensus in our Congress and on other types of measures. We could on these. And the instruments are both old and new. And I think, you know, it's not picking winners in a narrow sense, but it's picking large sectors and trying to create incentives for investment, obviously, and crowd in private sector investment. And from what I understand, there's been quite a lot of it in a number of areas. And so it's beginning to show some evidence of crowding in private investment. But has it been structured in a way that, you know, is sufficiently inclusive for our allies? I think that's an important question. And there have been some workarounds, but I think there's more to be done. And when you talk about the national security dimension, I would just say, there are a number of measures that have been introduced, and we have people here who've been the architects of some of that, that are specifically around import restrictions, export restrictions, investment restrictions. And as you know, our national security advisor has characterized this as a small yard with a high fence. And I think, that's not a static concept. That's one that we're continuing to work through what it encompasses by way of restrictions. And that introduces a lot of complexity for business. I support some dimensions of that, but I think clarity is important and guiding principles are important as well.
Yeah, I think I want to turn to Anish, but this Jake Sullivan distinguished national security, small yards and high fences, having sort of been also in a head of a country, the problem is the small yard has a tendency to get bigger and bigger. Yeah. So who is in the yard and who's out of the yard? And I think when that is going to be decided, I think it's important. I think everybody would agree with small yards and high fences. I think we also need to think about how that is in Europe. We had a session on European sovereignty also. But the question is really how large is the yard at some point? And but I think this is a good point. Anish, turning to India, and I said earlier, exponential growth, hugely successful. You're in 100 countries, as you said. Do you need government subsidies to be successful?
We don't need government subsidies to be successful. India has set up a very bold vision to reach 32 trillion of GDP by 2047. What that means from a manufacturing standpoint,
32 trillion.
32 trillion, which is larger than where the US is today, which is significantly larger than where China is today.
Yes, but they will also be larger at that time.
They will be larger, agree. What that means from a manufacturing standpoint is that manufacturing has to grow 16 times in the next 23 years. Manufacturing today is 15% of GDP, driven by a greater emphasis on services. It has to grow to 25% of GDP. For that to happen, the private sector is working with the government on a number of initiatives to reduce the cost of manufacturing, improve the ease of doing business, to enhance the quality of manufacturing. So subsidies are not part of that notion. Where subsidies come in is from a policy standpoint to make a transformation in the industry. And let me give an example where a subsidy has been used very effectively. We talk a lot about EVs, but among the most polluting are EVs or vehicles that operate in a city, in a crowded city. In India, we have three-wheelers and small four-wheelers that provide goods and transmit passengers in the last mile. The government came up with an incentive policy or a subsidy for transforming this from ICE to EV 3 years ago. There was a set subsidy per vehicle. That subsidy has now been reduced by half. Next year, it will be reduced by half again. The industry has gone from 0% electric to 25% electric already. In the next 4 to 5 years, it will be 100% electric. That's a classic example of a subsidy that achieves a policy objective and makes that work.
And Mahindra was in that business also. Right?
Mahindra was in that business. We went from 0% electric to 95% electric in the last 3 years. And that's something that we've helped drive that change from an EV standpoint, and something that helps pollution, helps reduce fuel emissions. All of those impacts are a lot more significant. And to have
is India, sorry to interrupt you, Anish, is India a country where politics and business work together very well in terms of accomplishing these goals?
Over the last few years, we've seen that. Because if we see the budgets over the last 4 years, they have not been populist budgets. They have been budgets that focus on capex for the long term. At this point, public sector capex has been higher than private sector capex growth. And that's one where the private sector has to step up to do a lot more. This year, I've got a second role as president of India's largest industry association. So I've had lots of chances for dialogue with government on multiple areas. And that partnership is very strong. The government listens. And what I also want to emphasize is a lot of this is not just for companies in India. There's a level playing field in every industry for companies from around the world. And as we think about manufacturing and the policies for manufacturing, these are ones that should apply to companies all around the world. And this is where India is looking at Europe in particular as a key partner to help drive its growth. And that can be in the form of investments in Europe, investments in India, but more so partnering to get the best of technology that's available in Europe, the marketplace that's available in India, to really create value.
So you're saying it's not exclusionary to non-Indians in a way, the industrial policy in India. So it applies to everybody, whether you're Indian or not Indian.
It applies to everybody. If you take the auto industry, for example, the number one and number two player in the auto industry are Japanese and Korean.
How do you look at Europe?
I would say with a lot of hope and opportunity. At the Mahindra Group, we are looking at Europe for partnerships to invest in Europe in certain areas, to partner with European companies to be able to tap into the Indian market, which is growing rapidly. And we feel that there are significant strengths that European companies can bring to India to be able to do that.
Are you also looking at Kosovo?
We are now. So we will. Yes.
Okay, Anish, good enough. Patrick, looking at the time, China, of course, huge debate on China, both in your country, Merit, and also in Europe. And you know, we have a session tomorrow with the economics minister and a Chinese automobile and the head of Mercedes, Ola Källenius. There's this debate about tariffs, which are about to become effective, I think, a month from now, if nothing else happens. German government having an interesting view on that one. The economics minister tomorrow will say that or will explain that. So there is a lot of discussion, and the story goes, key technologies, strategies. Xi Jinping, I don't want to make it too political for you. Xi Jinping has chosen key strategies. They're eating our lunch in many of these sectors. And a lot of it is due to subsidies and not just because it's innovation. Now, I know you are an entrepreneur, an innovator, also from China. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And how can we get out of this difficult situation? It's a small question.
Let me take a stab at it. First of all, I'm an investor. And actually, I grew up.
Entrepreneur.
Yes.
Ambassadors are sitting there.
Right, many of them.
Yeah.
But let me say this. I grew up as an investor in the US. And when I started in my career, I think I was so lucky that I learned the right system about us assessing good businesses. So we developed a framework. It's about how to assess America's best growth companies. That evolved later into assessing the best growth companies in the world. By the way, when I saw Anish today, I said 20 years ago, I knew this company. I knew this company was going to be a great company. And I built a model for American Mastercard. I know how tremendous that business has been. And by the way, I traveled to India, I traveled to Kosovo, and I traveled to a lot of places. Thank you very much. And if I may call you Hendrik, and inviting entrepreneurs to come to Berlin to have this dialogue. I think for quite a long time, we haven't spent a lot of time together as friends and peers and think about the world together. And with a little bit of borderless mindset. And the entrepreneurs who are coming with me from China and with your invitation, they're no different from entrepreneurs from America, from India, and probably from Kosovo. So, and they all have kind of a great idea, and then they're just trying to build it. And you used a word, I think that's the right one to describe the status quo. Complexity. It's just so complex right now. And if you're an entrepreneur today, when you start a business or you have a large business you want to run, there are just so many layers of complexity. It's been for a long time, it's only about growth and prosperity that as investors and entrepreneurs, they stay focused on. Because I know today's, this topic, subject is about industrial policy and geopolitics. But I just want to also remind everybody, it's actually the productivity gains that's going to take us out of the mess today. One thing I think a lot of people didn't really kind of pay attention to think about, what happened in the world. I thought the true inflection point happened in 2008. And before that, most of the countries' economy, the only exception is India, I would say, had much higher growth than post-2008. But after 2008, there was just a lot of liquidity injected into the system and keep everything afloat. Certainly, China was the manufacturing center for the world, so actually benefited with a lot of growth. But then with COVID, and everybody started to looking at the downside of globalization. This is where we're kind of stuck with. But having said that, I think great business leaders, and it's actually, you have a lot of responsibility as well as entrepreneurs to really carry the economy forward. We need a productivity gains. If we don't have productivity gains, I think we're just going to have a lot of big issues to have to deal with. And I had a conversation with Larry Summers, and he said, look, today, people spend 75% of their time and attention to events, only 25% on trends. But look at this world. We have energy transition, and we have demographics challenges, and AI is a big thing. How AI is going to be manifested in different ways. AI doesn't just happen in the virtual world. It has a lot of implications for the real world. Those are adding the layers of complexity to our discussion. I have just kind of one small idea, and Professor Röller, I think it's a great step one to get everybody talk with a dialogue like this. And what if we can all travel together and to go to India, to go to America, to go to China, to go to different parts of Europe, to really understand what's going on and to see a business together. I think people have different opinions, has a lot to do with they're exposed to different information, and information is not truth. And information is something you have to discover yourself. I think that process has been long forgotten. When I was a younger investor, analyst, I visited 300 companies a year. We call this kicking the tire. We haven't kicked a lot of tires these days. How many people in this room has been to Kosovo? Right?
You're all invited.
And that's the thing, right? And I think it's important, if I may.
Yeah, no, I think that's very nice. That's very true. Actually, the Berlin Global Dialogue, we did something in India. We're planning to do events during the year. So I'll pick you up on your idea that we do other things and we meet elsewhere. Maybe not all of us, but some of us, and some other times. But I want to bring you back. I agree with you. I mean, certainly I do agree with you as an economist that productivity and innovation is the answer to everything, in a way, most things. But I'm worried that that politics gets in the way. Are you not worried about that? For example, if there's a trade war, or if some governments are more actively intervening in the free marketplace. And I think the trend has been lately, at least globally, maybe not within blocks, even within blocks, it's gone a bit more inward looking, I think, also in your country and also in my country, actually. Aren't you worried about that trumping the productivity story you're telling us, which is well understood, and that's actually a bad thing in the end? Are you worried about that?
I'm deeply worried.
Okay.
I'm deeply worried. And if I may, I've just I think we really needed to go back and look at different parts of the world history. And you know, the Great Depression, every year for that 10 years, actually American economy had a surplus, but every country was trying to build trade barriers and protect themselves. That's really awful environment for any economy to perform. And again, I'm not a politician. I'm deeply worried with geopolitics.
I think the answer you've said that we need to talk more to each other, and I think he brought, just in all earnestness or fairness, you brought a group of 20 or 30 entrepreneurs to Berlin, which were not government people. These were private entrepreneurs who all had very big, successful Chinese companies, and they tried to link up with businesses over here. So I think that this is what we were discussing for a day and a half, sort of having that exchange at the business level is a good thing. But in the end, I think government will also matter, and we cannot be immune to that. So, Anish, how do you see that? The role in India, you say the government is actually very helpful in terms of raising your productivity, right?
It is, but as you said, the challenges are not in any one country. It's about the geopolitical issues that we see around us and the uncertainty it creates, because that puts certain brakes on taking risks, on putting investments in as well. And this is one where forums like the Berlin Global Dialogue should help us create that openness, that discussion, and hopefully be able to address some of those issues. And I agree with Patrick. This is something that deeply concerns us as well in terms of what we see happening around the world.
President, how do you see this issue of industrial policy and Kosovo? And I mean, you're in a situation where the security issue, as you said, are very important, but developing the economy in Kosovo is also an important issue. How do you see that?
Perhaps just to quickly jump into the issue of what should be the role of the government, I'm a strong believer in the role of private sector as the real engine behind the economic growth of every country. But at the same time, because of everything that was just mentioned earlier, there are certain sectors, depending on the country, obviously, but there are certain sectors that will need the help of the government, the subsidizing from the government. And of course, each country has their own potential, their own industry, their own traditions, and also the way where they can contribute, not just internally, but also to regional and global trade. But there are areas, especially if we're talking about energy security right now, and to connect to the issue of security, Europe has faced in the past couple of years one of the biggest energy crises that we've ever had. And it was created because of security reasons, because the largest part of Europe was also dependent on Russia. And then there are many of us that are not dependent on Russia, but we're dependent on coal. And that means, my country has one of the largest pollutions at the level of Europe, and we need to not leave the private sector alone in fighting that fight. We need to make sure that we aggressively invest in renewables. We need to make sure that we learn a lot from countries that have succeeded in that regard, like the great example that you gave about EVs, electric vehicles. We need then to work with partners such as the United States that has been there for us in making sure that we make that transition through programs such as the MCC and so on and so forth, and also make sure that the European Union steps up. Now, with the new growth plan, there are a lot of, nice words and dreams. We need more tangible results so that we don't let the security challenges get into the way of economic development, as well as moving forward when it comes to energy policy, as well as energy security. So in that sense, we've seen, of course, especially in the last couple of years, crisis after crisis. It started with the pandemic and went on with a big economic inflation crisis, economic crisis, energy crisis, still a lot of these continuing. So I think while the private sector still remains the engine behind the success, there are times when the government really needs to step up. So per capita, Kosovo has been the country with the strongest support to the private sector post-pandemic, and also in getting out of the inflation crisis and so on. And a lot of, schemes that were there to support our citizens, but yet there still needs to be some government support. And my final point, so that I don't forget to mention this, I need to make sure that I do this everywhere. One of the main instruments that we've used was also the economic empowerment of women, because we had a very high inactivity rate among women, about 80%. And it was horrendous, because if you don't use 50% of your economic potential, which is half of your population, you lose also a lot of money. You lose a lot in terms of economic growth. So a lot of what we did as institutions was to support private companies to employ women through subsidies, and that has led them to more growth, but that has also led the country to more economic growth. So there are areas, of course, depending on what challenge the country is facing, where the government needs to step in, while still letting the private sector, I would say, lead in terms of economic development.
Thank you for making that point about participation in the labor force. The new growth plan, that's the Balkan plan from the EU, which
the new growth plan.
New growth, where they promise
still just on paper.
They promise you support.
Correct.
For reforms in line with EU regulation.
Yes,
right?
I mean, we are right now at a 100% rate when it comes to alignment with the European Union, both in terms of foreign and defense policy. That doesn't necessarily mean that the EU money goes where the alignment is. Just to give you an example, there are 6 Western Balkan countries right now that are benefiting from these programs. 63% of the EU dedicated money for the Western Balkans goes to, guess which country? The one that is not aligned with the EU, to Serbia. Serbia is about 46% alignment rate.
Why is that?
I wish I had the answer to that question. Maybe when you talk to Macron tomorrow, you can ask that question. And other European leaders, for that matter. So they are only at a 46% alignment with the European Union. Nevertheless, they get more than 60% of the money of the European Union.
Maybe you should align less, then you get more money, maybe.
Well, I don't think we're going to go in that direction, but I do understand the joke, and a lot of people actually ask that question. Should we align less in order to get more support? But the 5 of us, the rest of us, Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, are at a 100% alignment, but all of us together get only 37% of the financial support. So this needs to change. EU money needs to go hand in hand with EU values. That's what we believe.
Makes a lot of sense. I think there's a question, looking at the time, and then we don't have much more. There's a question from the students. Yes, please say who you are. And maybe which university. You can step up in front of the microphone, yes, and then also say which university you're from, please.
Okay, thanks for your all sharing. I'm Yu Chen from Beijing Renmin University, and also one of the members from BGD Young Voice. And my question is, I think there are increasingly geopolitical fragmentations because, for example, European unions put high tariff on the EVs, as we all know. And I want to know, like, for example, the countries like Kosovo, could you help me to elaborate on how the country's plans to, for example, to balance the pursuit of economic resilience and through the industrial policy with the need to maintain maybe the open trade relationship and international cooperations in this increasingly geopolitical fragmentations? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Look, when a country within Europe strives to become a member of the European Union, one of the very first things that we do is sign what we call a stabilization and association agreement. It's an agreement that is called stabilization and association, but it's practically a trade agreement. It allows for free trade between our country, that is not a member of the EU yet, and the rest of the European Union. But then it sets so many rules that you have to abide by. So despite of the will that the country might have to have open trade based on the principles that you've mentioned, you have to abide by the rules of the European Union when it comes to economic resilience, when it comes to other trade issues. You have to meet all of those criteria if you want to move ahead. So if you want to move ahead and then open chapters of negotiations and finally become a member, you would have to abide by those rules. You can't set them entirely by yourselves. There are, a few countries that actually have left the European Union, and the reason has been precisely this, mostly this, not entirely trade, but mostly trade, because they did not want to abide by all of these strict rules that the European Union sets when it comes to trade. But just looking at other members that are now in the European Union and how much of an economic resilience they've built by becoming a member from the moment they've become members to date, that's the example that we're seeking. So a lot of rules that you have to abide by, but at the same time, the benefits are enormous. And not just economic, if I might add. It's also about democracy. It's also about rule of law. It's also about other fundamentals that we really trust in and that we believe make us more resilient. So economic resilience is one thing, but for those of us that have lived under really extreme conditions, that were victims of genocide for so many years, it's also about defending freedom. It's also about defending democracy. It's also about defending human rights. So we believe they should go hand in hand, economic resilience and democratic resilience. Mm-hmm.
It's almost a nice final word, but we have a few more minutes.
Okay.
Merit, yes.
Well, I wanted to just, I think you started us off this morning, Henrik, with a comment that you didn't think the world was deglobalizing, but it was changing. And I think that is very much my view. So it's right to call out and really focus on where fragmentation is occurring, what's driving it, where the examples of it, and so forth. But I think we also have to look at what are real patterns of trade and investment. And there's been marked change in US-China trade. Tariffs are part of it. These other restrictions are part of it. But and hyperglobalization in terms of manufactured trade obviously is past its peak, but you are seeing, continued trade in services. And so I think we need to be a little bit more clear about where interdependence and globalization is continuing and where governments are introducing more barriers and speed bumps. And I would think that this would be a community that would care a lot about maintaining the healthy parts of that interdependence and not weaponizing all instruments of interdependence. So I just say fragmentation is something to look at, but maintaining the interoperability of the system and keeping vigilant about where the risks are and aren't is part of what this dialogue can contribute to.
Yeah, I think that's true. There is time for one question, if there is any burning questions. No, I think it's a bit... otherwise, maybe I make a comment. So I think basically so for me, the conclusion from all of this is that I think Anish made the point about, productivity. You need certain industrial policies, transformation towards renewables, which makes sense that there should be close cooperation between governments and firms to do this, and it should not be discriminatory. I think this is very important. This is also an issue which would be WTO relevant, Janet. And India is, of course, going through this enormous amount of growth, driven also by demographic factors. So I think this is the view. I think your view, which is, I think, very pertinent, it's about innovation, it's about productivity, let's work together. I think your suggestion about, visiting each other, talking about, you do this anyways. I think we as Berlin Global Dialogue will facilitate that. I think that's the good point. Of course, you have the sword of the government on top of you all the time, if I may say, but I think this cooperation amongst businesses and thinking about innovation and value added, I think that's very important. I hope that will continue and is successful. And I think Merit's sort of making the point that, as you just said, there should be balance between this new form of whatever, globalization, whatever you want to call it, where I think we have to have the right balance between support along Anish and possibilities of restricting trade between countries, which is beneficial for everybody. And this is also my view, as I was trying to say this morning, that it's not easy striking the right balance there, because we have a lot to benefit, in particular also Europe and Germany, from free and open markets. And if we fall into a heavy-handed industrial policies, the finance minister was, of course, having I don't know if you remember, he is having the orthodox, don't tell him I said that, the orthodox German view. Don't need subsidies, money is there, the government just sets the framework and then companies will innovate and everything will go. But I think getting the right balance there, I think, is a challenge. And I like his suggestion of let's talk about it and let's do it. And then, of course, the president making also many important points, but in particular also the geopolitical and security issue. And I think your point about this war in Europe, which is a big signal and is very important for us. We had a discussion earlier. I didn't want to say that that the position on other countries on this side of the table, let's say, on the issue of Ukraine is a very important issue for the Europeans.
Absolutely.
And I'm not in the game. I mean, you're there all the time when this is being discussed. Even though neutrality is being claimed, or maybe it's even there, this is a very important issue for Europe. So I think this, as you were saying, and you got applause for that, the position on Ukraine and not getting that problem resolved, that would be a disaster for us. So I think that trumps, in a way, many, many other things in Europe, even though we in Europe and in Germany have this productivity discussion, as we were just saying. So Europe is not going to be relevant if it's not going to be productive and successful economically. So I think that is a little bit, I like your view, if I may say so. And given where you're from, I think your view is also the best view you can have, which is this productivity innovation. But there are challenges also where you are, and and I think this is important. And I think, Janet, I think we are aligned on many things, and you're in a country which has the geopolitical challenges galore. And I think it's great to have a woman like you, if I may say so, running this country. And I think your point about gender participation is not an industrial policy point, but I think that's an important point as well. So I think for me, it's a challenge, and we need to move forward. And I think the business community and dialogue between politics and business, and also between business amongst the rest of the world, I think that is the way forward and the answer. Is that a little bit the common ground, or not? President, you have the final word. Is that okay?
Sure. No, perhaps just to thank each and every one of you, and to thank everyone that is present here and especially you, for giving us the opportunity. As I envisaged at the beginning, I learned a lot from the other panelists.
And you have investment coming now from...
What an honor. I mean, it's India, China, the United States, Germany, and Kosovo. Would have thought in the same table. So, but at the same time, I think it's so crucial that when we sit down with CEOs of businesses, you see how things can be resolved. Very practical and very tangible. And it should serve as a lessons learned for many politicians around the world. That is in most cases the approach that we need to take to resolving most of the issues. But of course, while productivity and gains are extremely important, what we have learned in our continent is that in many, many cases, trade does not necessarily equal trust. Because if that was the case, we would have never had a Russian invasion of Ukraine. They were each other's main trading partners for decades. So while trade is the cornerstone of so many relations, at the same time, we need to keep an eye on issues of security. We need to keep an eye on basic principles of good faith in terms of neighborly relations first and foremost, but also relations with countries that are quite far away from us. And just like in a contract, it's about gains, but what is the cornerstone of the contracts in many cases is the good faith principle. So I would call for that as well to be the cornerstone of relations between countries if we want to prevent security challenges that are then preventing trade relations. I believe that both India and China want a strong economic partner in Europe, right?
Correct.
Well, that can be achieved only if we're safe and secure. And we will only be safe and secure if Ukraine wins this war. If they do not, it's going to be a complete mess in our continent. And you will not have a good trading partner in Europe. So just not to oversimplify it, but I think it's so important that partners across the world, not just in our continent, give us the support that we need as a continent to first and foremost be safe and secure, for that to open the way for stronger trade relations with the rest of the countries around the world.
I think this is excellent. Thank you, President. And I think we almost have a theme for next year's Berlin Global Dialogue, Carolyn, and building trust or something, because this is also a point which was made this morning, I think, by Larry Fink. I think he said that, and I think trust is very important. And how do we build trust? I think that's important. Merit, Patrick, Anish, thank you very much. And we close this session, and now there's dinner, Anish, so there will be shuttle services outside. We're closing the session, and I'm told by my colleagues behind me we start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock on time, because we are in Germany. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.